Warning, this video does contain spoilers, which I try to keep to a minimum, but you have been warned. You know, I planned to do Planetary Annihilation this week, but I also wanted to do something more positive since both Battle Mage and Risen 3 were on the negative side. I'm not doing Planetary Annihilation anymore. Instead, I looked through my games library and decided to critique something that got released last year and I never got a chance to play it, namely Sang-Froid, A Tale of Werewolves Tome I. It's kind of a weird mix of action and tactics combined with some progression elements. I don't know exactly how well it sold, but I do think it flew under the radar, which is a shame in my opinion. I think some of it has to do with false advertising or at least misguided advertising, since a lot of people claim that it's similar to games in the tower defense genre, and that's not really true. Not to mention that the genre has been claimed by the mobile market in part, and that's not exactly the kind of audience Sang-Froid is meant for. But how does it play exactly? Well, it goes something like this. Each night you're attacked by an assortment of creatures ranging from banal wolves to diabolical werewolves and even the mythical Wendigos. But the day before you have the chance to set traps or lay other useful objects on the ground to help you, the end goal being to survive the night with your buildings and yourself intact. Now, I intentionally used the word tactics instead of strategy the paragraph before because a majority of this game's traps require you activating them on site, very little happens off screen. And it's here that I think that it differs from the tower defense genre fundamentally, because formulating plans isn't the challenging or really the focused part of this game. There is a plethora of solutions to most levels and you know exactly from where and how many enemies will come. The most important part is the execution of said plans. Most traps are designed to swing battles in your favor rather than outright winning the battle for you. This becomes much more obvious the farther you go into the game and the enemies become harder and harder to kill. I guess the closest you can relate it to is Dungeon Defenders or Orcs Must Die, but the pacing differs significantly. In those games you have these long drawn out levels with many waves that require you adding defense upon defense to defeat an ever increasing horde of monsters. Sang-Froid, on the other hand, is a much more compact and tense experience. Most levels don't go past the 10-minute mark and you only have to deal with a handful of waves, but a much greater focus is put on mobility. You can have large waves that attack you on all sides, followed by smaller ones that are meant to put you out of position. Also, the enemy count is much lower and you aren't that strong in direct combat, so battles tend to be more stop and go rather than the continuous action that Orcs Must Die and Dungeon Defenders offers. Now, regarding the story, the whole action is situated around the small village of Woolsville in the Canadian countryside, and more specifically, the plot takes place in 1858 from the 5th of December to the 24th of December, each night representing one of the game's levels. Our heroes are Jacques, Jos and Josephine, three siblings of Irish and Native American descent that must defend their cabin and its surroundings against increasingly greater supernatural threats. From what I understand, the narrative here is inspired specifically by Quebec folklore rather than a general Canadian background, and that doesn't surprise me. After all, this region of Canada has its own language, Quebecois, so naturally they also have their own culture and traditions. But be prepared for some very outlandish reinterpretations of common myths regarding werewolves. My problem though is with the tone of the story rather than the content. It fluctuates between Canadian Bram Stoker and B-grade action horror movies. Some transitions depict tense scenes with gore and viscera, while in others the devil shows up. I'm not kidding, a red-skinned tuxedo-wearing, mustache-twirling devil appears.
That was when I knew we were going to do great things together.
The story can't seem to decide if it wants us to fear what would come next by hinting at darker themes, or if it wants us to enjoy ourselves in a goofy action romp complete with meteor shower wolfmen. Yes, there is an enemy that attacks by summoning chunks of the moon out of the sky. What more do I need to say? But with that being said, I will admit that I was curious to see what comes next, so the story does have some value, though I do think a lot of it comes from the novelty of the setting rather than the writing, which is weird and sort of sad considering a professional author apparently helped in this game's development. But honestly, it's the gameplay that kept me hooked, and there is a surprisingly vast number of systems here that are tied together in a very Deus Ex fashion. Now, by that I mean that there are a lot of light elements taken from other games that combined together allow player expressivity. You see, Deus Ex had neither the best shooting system, the best dialogue system or the best stealth system, but what it had was that it combined all those together. In the same way, Sang-Froid mixes light combat and stealth with planning and progression to create a very enjoyable and somewhat unique experience. I don't really want to spoil how it all works because I think a great sense of enjoyment can be derived from tinkering with the systems and mechanics here without any prior knowledge. I am going to say though that this game feels like it was designed with a very realistic approach in mind. You have wind, sound, ammo and a bunch of other variables that lead to the large number of systems used here. It's almost as if the design team sat down at the start of the project, thought of all the things that would happen in a werewolf defense scenario and then tried creating a rule set to incorporate all that. The only downside to this is that the game is very tutorial heavy for the first 30 minutes, and combined with a lot of cutscenes, it does take a little while before you are given real agency over your choices. Another highlight for me was the permanency aspect. Traps that are not set off and zip lines remain on the map the following nights, and this creates a light feeling of endearment. It was enjoyable to manage to have a zipline survive from the start to the end of the game with me. This way the map itself can tell stories without words, just ludic language. This permanency aspect also creates a metagame that becomes more significant if you want to try the harder mode, which is playing Jack instead of Joss. You really do need to know what comes next. Before I start with a few things that I don't like, I will mention that this game does something which I love, which is gradient victory. Time is money in Sang-Froid. Literally, each day you have a fixed amount of action points which are spent when using traps, but those action points can also be used to cut wood and thus receive money. The game incentivizes you to play to the best of your ability by having a very tangible scaling reward. The less time spent on traps, the more time spent on gathering money. And now comes the bad. For one, I really don't like how the descriptions in this game are hyper-explicative. They provide information and spoilers about monsters which you encounter hours later, and this sort of kills the mystery. I especially recommend you avoid hovering over skill tooltips since you can basically see the entirety of this game's arsenal from the get-go. Another thing I'm not a fan of is the push towards melee weapons. Since there is a gradient victory like I described before, the thing that costs the least amount of money is the thing you want to maximize. I would have preferred for the melee combat to stop being altogether efficient in the later levels, but that's not the case. After a while you can clear levels just with combat alone and firewalls to make the enemy take detours, thus giving time to reach all of them. I should note that playing the other brother, Jacques, lessens this issue significantly, since he is basically hard mode. The character's stats don't allow him to engage in combat for long periods of time. Well, at the beginning, I am playing this game again with him and I'm starting to maximize melee again. But I should address the elephant in the room. It's not a pretty game. In fact, the graphical fidelity leaves a lot to be desired, both in-game and during cutscenes. There isn't a lot to say about this though, it just doesn't look very good and that's kinda cut and dry. I guess that my complaint is that they could have stylized the game more to create a pleasant aesthetic. Take Paper Sorcerer for example, a game that really manages to do a lot with very little, specifically just with black and white. An odd thing that I want to mention though is that this game set me on the closest draw distance by default, and for some reason I didn't bother to check the options menu until after I finished my first playthrough. And I honestly thought that the low visibility was a game design choice like Silent Hill, so I kinda recommend it? It makes things more tense when creatures pop out of the shadows, even though you can see them on the minimap, so I recommend playing on this setting. But anyway, experiment to see which one you like. Fundamentally, I really like this game and I wasn't honestly expecting that when I started it. The whole experience reminded me of that one preparation scene from Predator. And it was also a pleasant surprise to see this many mechanics tied together so relatively well. I will also admit that after playing Lichdom, a game from a new studio that has very good graphical fidelity but very messy gameplay, I was kinda happy to see a new studio that wanted to focus on gameplay first, and decided to take a blow in the graphics department for that. In closing, I will say that I just saw the trailer for Artifice's new game, and if they combine that stylized artwork with the same attention to detail for gameplay, it will surely be an enjoyable experience. But in the meantime, think about giving Sang-Froid A Tale of Werewolves Tome I some attention. I don't think you'll be disappointed.